I'm Jill Power, the convener and Director of Product Management for Compliance Sheriff, which is an automated accessibility testing solution. And we also have Meredith Knopf, who's our incoming convener and a Learning Commons librarian at Indiana University. Today, we're excited. We've invited the project managers for LEAP. You might have seen that in the UAIG discussion group, the Library eResources Accessibility Project in Ontario. And they're going to join us so we can learn how Ontario college libraries are working together to meet and exceed their legislative requirements for eResources with LEAP, including their plans to integrate accessibility criteria, pool their resources, prioritize and share assessments, and build awareness and capacity among college library staff regarding accessibility. This is about a half-an-hour presentation, so we left plenty of time for Q&A and discussion at the end. You can either ask questions directly, or you can chat, do it through the chat, and I'll read them aloud for the team. And if we're not able to answer any questions that come up just due to timing, then we'll follow up back with the discussion list. And I understand that within 48 hours after the presentation, that it is being recorded and it will be shared with all of those on the list. Our speakers today are the two LEAP project managers. We have Siobán. Linnen is the Projects and Communications Coordinator at the Ontario Colleges Library Service in Toronto. She's currently serving as project manager for the Library eResources Accessibility Project alongside Corinne Abba. Corinne is an academic librarian at George Brown College in Toronto and an advocate for inclusive librarianship. She's the chair of the AODA Committee for College Libraries in Ontario and currently serves as a co-project manager for LEAP. So welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and present to the group today, and hopefully we'll have some good discussion following that. And I will let you guys go ahead. I think everybody can see the screen, but please let us know if you cannot see the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And thank you to the ACRL and UAIG for inviting us and for hosting. My name is Corinne, and together with my colleague Siobán, we would like to share with you our work on LEAP, which is the Library eResources Accessibility Project, an initiative that seeks accessible solutions for library eResources. So we'd like to start by providing some context for the project that we call LEAP, including what it is, where we're coming from, and a little bit of history in terms of the project, our legislative requirements, and along with some of the rationale for this work. So we'd like to establish our vision and describe what we have done and are doing to meet and exceed accessibility requirements for educational libraries, specifically colleges in Ontario. So this will include creating the LEAP tool, integrating accessibility criteria into our workflows, pooling our resources in the college sector, prioritizing and sharing assessments with contributing members of LEAP, and also building awareness and capacity among college library staff regarding accessibility. And then finally, at the end, we would like to discuss where we're going, next steps in the project, and how we can collaborate with you and our wider community going forward. So underlying the context and motivation of LEAP are three fundamental principles. Our professional ethics, which include advocating for equal access and equal opportunity for everyone, and providing a proactive, solutions-based approach regarding the accessibility of our library e-resources. Second, it's creating a solution that benefit our users. Accessible resources benefit everyone, but our focus is on improving services to people with disabilities, to people with diverse abilities and accessibility needs. Our current scope for this project is to address the needs specifically of our students, faculty and staff, and other patrons of the Ontario College library sector. And then third, we're also meeting and exceeding our legislative requirements, including the need to provide, procure, or acquire digital resources in an accessible or conversion-ready format upon request. So I realize we're from all over and we may have some different legislative requirements. So I did want to give a brief overview of the legislative requirements in Ontario, Canada. So in 2005, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, what we call the AODA, was enacted to improve accessibility for Ontario residents with physical or mental disabilities, with the goal of achieving a fully accessible province by 2025. So the Act laid out a plan for service providers to fulfill their obligations under the law and provided rolling deadlines to meet the requirements incrementally, with specific dates tied to the tasks to be completed, with different milestones depending on the size of the organization. So specifically, the obligations for colleges and universities are tied to legislative deadlines related to customer service, training resources, websites, print compliance, captioning, and multimedia, which includes library databases. And our current project, LEAP, addresses the 2020 deadline for digital or multimedia resources. So here is the requirement on the screen for you. In broadest terms, Section 18 of the AODA can be applied to all digital or multimedia resources in an educational library. And we, the library, are obligated to make any resources accessible, even those that we may not control, but make available through contractual relationships. So this includes media, streamed content, library databases, and third-party products such as LibGuides. Because databases are so varied, it would be very challenging to respond upon request without significant training and a mechanism in place that tracks the accessibility or the inaccessibility of our resources. So LEAP focuses on specifically the accessibility of library databases. And the one catch is that the AODA doesn't specify how we should determine whether or not a resource is accessible. So without specific guidance on what is required to ensure the accessibility of our resources, we had to start somewhere, and we knew there wasn't one simple answer. So we had to consider a blended approach that addressed varied barriers and accessibility needs. So the first thing we did was thought about what was already in existence that we could use or adapt. So we know that we can request a VPAT from our database providers. This is the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, a document that indicates compliance with the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, accessibility guidelines. But we didn't feel comfortable relying solely on vendor-supplied accessibility statements because we found that they're often incomplete or inaccurate. We can use open source tools. So tools such as Wave are excellent and can be used to test our resources in-house, but we didn't want to rely exclusively on automated evaluators because they tend to exclude many important accessibility criteria that can only be tested by humans. We also wanted to develop the competencies of our staff and develop strategies for user support. A really great example of this is Open University in the UK. This is an institution that for each database in their listing, which is available online, they link accessibility issues that may be encountered, and then they provide specific instructions to help mitigate the impact of those issues. Another thing we thought about was engaging in usability testing. It's really important for accessibility work in particular to form advisory groups with a good cross-section of users of all abilities. So as part of our ongoing work towards accessibility, it was really key for us to reach out and compensate our users for their testing and expertise. And then finally, we knew we had to establish accessibility criteria based on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG 2.0, and similar resources to ensure consistency. Although some institutions were or are already evaluating their e-resources for accessibility, we couldn't find any libraries that established or shared a systematic method or standardized criteria for these evaluations. So this brings us to LEAP. Back in 2015, it started as a research project for Ontario College Libraries. It was called the eResources AODA Audit Project. And our mandate was to research how libraries can support equity of access to their e-resources, thinking about the use of different adaptive technologies and the varied needs of users. The idea was to create a template to evaluate the accessibility features of library databases, outlining minimum standards and best practices. We started by gathering all the work that was being done at the colleges in our system locally, as well as related resources. So we wanted to build something comprehensive that could be shared. We also wanted to propose a method for requesting accessibility features from vendors informed by their VPATs, and then be able to propose a model to share completed audits in a digital repository. As we worked through this, though, we realized that we would need more than a common template. We would need to offer a tool that includes more in-depth testing and analysis than could be included in a template, and so LEAP was born. So in our project charter, we formalized our project goal as follows. We wanted to identify minimum standards for e-resource accessibility, either as defined by the AODA or as recommended by other existing best practices. We wanted to create a checklist of criteria and/or a tool for evaluating e-resources based on those standards. We wanted to recommend a way for colleges to integrate the evaluation process into their local workflows. We wanted to recommend a way that the colleges can pool their resources and share completed evaluations with each other. And lastly, we wanted to build awareness and capacity among college library staff regarding the accessibility of library resources. And so from there, we proceeded with an environmental scan to understand accessibility requirements, identify guidelines and best practices, and to try to gain an understanding of what other libraries were doing, both within the college sector in Ontario and beyond. So since we were not only building a tool, but an assessment process, an early important step for our LEAP steering committee was to compile a list of criteria from a range of web accessibility standards. And then we wanted to assess the criteria that was needed versus what might be irrelevant or out of scope for this project. This process went alongside our in-depth research to make sure we understood which accessibility needs each criteria is supposed to address. So it was essential that we worked with the Student Advisory Committee for direct feedback from persons who use adaptive technologies. We worked from a list of over 100 criteria, and we narrowed that down to 33 criteria, which we then grouped into specific categories addressing the appearance, the navigation, the structure, and the content of any given database. Ultimately, we identified one list of core criteria that could be used to form the basis of our assessment process.
So once we had that core list of accessibility criteria, we started to develop an assessment process. So for each of the criteria on our list, we developed a question, or in many cases, a series of questions for library staff to answer. We wanted the assessment results to be easy to understand and consistent, and we also wanted to build a process that allowed for responses to be automatically scored. So we structured all questions so that they could be answered with always, sometimes, never, or not applicable. We opted to keep it a 3-point scale, with always indicating that a criteria passed, never indicating that a criteria failed, and sometimes indicating that the criteria was inconsistently met. Because college library staff members will share the work of assessing e-resources, and because many library staff reported to us that they don't currently have expertise or experience in this area, our goal was to create an assessment process that could be followed by the non-expert. And so we developed instructional content that provided background information to help library staff understand the importance of each criteria for users, as well as step-by-step instructions for each question being asked. Additionally, we provided detailed documentation with instructions for how to use specific techniques, for example, how to navigate a website with a keyboard, and instructions for third-party tools that are used throughout the process. So here's an example of one of the criteria on our list and the questions that were developed to test that criteria. WCAG 2.0 criteria 2.1.1 states in part that all functionality of the content must be operable for a keyboard interface. Our goal was to break this criteria into testable components. To meet this particular criteria requires that several conditions are met, And so to ensure clarity and consistency in the responses, we broke these into separate questions. In this particular example, I think there are 6 questions in the section, but as an example, 3 of those questions relating to this criteria include: can keyboard focus be moved to all page elements? Is default keyboard navigation order logical and intuitive following the visual flow of the page as described above? And does all interactive functionality work via keyboard consistently and as expected? And so this is a look at just a snippet of the instructional content for this particular group of tests. So we provide background information in the why is this important section, explaining why keyboard navigation is essential and how users access content through keyboard navigation. And then we provide step-by-step instructions for how to carry out these tests. And because these particular questions need to be tested with a keyboard, we provide detailed instructions on keyboard navigation in the linked documentation. As we started to wrap up content development, OCLS engaged a developer to build the LEAP tool, which we're now calling the Library eResources Accessibility Portal. And phase 1 of development of the portal ended this past September. So there are 2 main components of the portal. It's a self-audit tool that allows library staff at participating institutions to evaluate the accessibility of library eResources. This tool includes our assessment process, and it guides library staff through the process of manually assessing an electronic resource, and then it captures the results of their assessment as they go. And as staff move through that assessment, a score is automatically calculated based on the responses that they input. LEAP is also a repository of completed reports that staff can review to help make acquisition decisions, support library users, and advocate for accessible eResources. Each report will include the results from the assessment as well as the score. There's also a user dashboard built in to help users keep track of their assessments. We do have a long list of wish lists for our portal. The core development, the core functionality is developed, but we have engaged our developer for a second phase of development to improve navigation and add a few high priority items from our wish list. And we wanted to show just a few screenshots so you could get a sense of how this works. So we're looking at here the home page. And on the home page, you can see a list of recently completed assessments. This is all test content at the moment. And then users can access completed assessments by going to the assessment tab at the top. To start an assessment, users need to find the eResource that they'd like to assess. And then once they do that, they can have the option to start a new assessment. This is what the modules look like in process. As you can see, they're designed quite simply. This is the instructional content for our content scaling section. And then you see the why is this important section, and then the step-by-step instructions. And then these sections are followed by the questions, and you can see there's a drop-down menu and a space for notes. So when completing the assessments, users would have the eResource open in a separate window. They read the instructions, assess that criteria, and then choose their response. And they can add a note and to add some context if they wish. Going through the modules automatically generates an assessment response. So completed assessments are stored in the report, I should say. Completed assessments are stored in the LEAP repository where library staff can see the overall score. And in this case, we've just blurred out those scores because these are just test assessments. And for anything they find on the list, they can click through to see the detailed assessment report. So taking a quick peek at how that looks. This is the assessment summary. And each report will contain an assessment summary that gives the overall score, a score for each of the modules. And you can see the 4 modules listed here that cover the interface appearance, the navigation, the structure, and the content. And then users can click through into each of the modules to see a list of responses for each of the criteria in that module. So this is what the detailed view of module 2 looks like for a test resource. So it will list the response to each of the assessment questions along with any notes made by the staff member. These modules each have several questions, so it does lead to a fairly long list. And so one of the things that our developer is currently working on is the ability to filter this list. That way users can go into a module and easily identify, for example, all criteria that failed or that had issues for a particular e-resource. And we're also developing functionality so that users can download the report summary and full results as a CSV file. And we think that will be helpful when it comes to, for example, communicating with vendors to be able to highlight the issues with a specific database. So we're very excited for the first year of assessments, and we're looking forward to hearing the feedback that staff have of the tool. We do plan to continue to develop the tool and the testing process to make sure that it's meeting the needs of the library community. The LEAP team has been working hard over the past year to think about how the colleges will collaborate going forward. We have a group that is developing a plan to implement the tool locally across our 24 partner libraries in Ontario in time for April 2020. A working group has developed recommendations for how the colleges will work together going forward to develop priorities for the service and to complete assessment. We have a training and competency building group that is developing training material for library staff on both the use of the tool, but also on accessibility evaluation more broadly to go over some of the techniques that they need to use. And as we head into our pilot year, we have a working group that's developing a plan to gather metrics to help us assess the success of the project and the portal and the service. One of the recommendations from one of our working groups is to establish a LEAP steering committee, and that group will be responsible for establishing assessment priorities in collaboration with participating libraries. Each of the participating libraries will be responsible for conducting a number of assessments each year, depending on the size of the college and taking into account local resources and capacity. The working group that developed these recommendations made sure that we weren't burdening the colleges with a really high number. And even with each college completing only the minimum suggested number of assessments, we hope to have 50 e-resources assessed in the first year. And then every year, the steering committee is going to have to work with our participating colleges to develop an annual assessment priority list and distribute those assessments among the colleges to avoid duplication and make sure that higher priority e-resources are assessed first. We expect that that will take into account several factors, including usage levels, the number of colleges that subscribe to a particular resource, as well as priorities put forward by individual colleges. We've also identified that e-resources will need to be reassessed over time as platforms change. And so our steering committee will need to establish a process for identifying and prioritizing e-resource reassessment. The steering committee will also be responsible for setting overall strategic directions for the LEAP service. So that will include identifying potential directions for future work to ensure that the results of the assessments are being used effectively to improve e-resource accessibility. So that could include improving and sharing licensing language around accessibility requirements, developing a strategy for communicating the results of LEAP reports with vendors, developing best practices for college libraries in incorporating accessibility requirements into acquisitions processes, and developing recommendations for translating results into user support. So this is work that would likely be undertaken by working groups in the future, and it offers library staff the opportunity to learn from each other and work together to advocate for and acquire accessible electronic resources.
So the crowdsource model saves the colleges time and resources and allows each college the opportunity to participate in a number of different ways, from completing assessments to participating in the steering committee or various working groups established to develop best practices or undertake advocacy efforts. By sharing that workload, each library only contributes a few assessments annually and has access to many more. So each college contributes as few as one assessment per year, but we anticipate, as Siobán said, we'll be able to add at least 50 to the repository each year without further cost to the college. So through peer-led training and by learning to complete assessments, library staff develop a deeper understanding of accessibility issues and the barriers, which they can then use to bolster their advocacy efforts and better support their patrons. And then finally, the LEAP tool ensures a standard assessment process and a standardized report, which means it can be easily interpreted and compared. So as we look forward to envision the project's success, we are looking to you and the wider community for opportunities to collaborate and to discuss different strategies that are being used by others as well. To support the success of our library patrons, we want to continue to build a solutions-based community of practice, which includes nurturing accessibility champions, appealing to experts, developing collaborative standards, sharing best practices, and integrating accessibility into our everyday workflows. Thank you so much. I hope this was helpful and informative, and Siobán and I would love to open it up for any questions that you might have, either through the chat or if you wanted to unmute and ask, that's great as well.
Okay, I do see a question coming through in the chat. Will your developers release any source code for public use? Pretty please. From Sean Brannon.
That is a very good question. I don't want to promise anything, but I'm fairly sure, if I think back to our contract, that we did ensure that we own the final product so that we can share that code with others. But that's something I can double check.
Will you release any of your reports so that multiple institutions aren't recreating assessments? So I guess of the same database, somebody else might be evaluating maybe within the US, maybe not in Toronto, but could leverage the results.
That's another great question, and I think we'll ultimately probably go to our steering committee to figure out how to collaborate with other institutions. I do see the follow-up, another question, can institutions outside of Ontario participate? And that's something, again, that our steering committee and OCLS will need to explore. We look even just within the Ontario system, just the colleges being able to collaborate means less work for everyone, which is nice, but also just a greater number of assessments. So we really do think that collaborating beyond Ontario, if possible, would be a great way forward. So that's something that will be looked at in the future for sure.
And Adina Malikin has a question. Are the questions you have for librarians to evaluate the eResources publicly available? So I guess the template or, the actual assessment questions.
Not yet. Again, that's something we can definitely look into.
And I think I missed a question. Amy Dreyer had mentioned that the Big Ten Academic Alliance's Library Accessibility Committee does this by outsourcing assessments and shares those reports online.
Yes, we have seen them start to do that over recent years, and it is good to see different people doing this as well. And the more we can kind of share and coordinate, the better.
And Heidi Schroeder did put a link into the chat for anybody who's interested in that as well. And Judy Cobb has a question. Have you encountered individual institutions requiring their own locally created test results and not accepting external test results?
So we haven't actually started the process of testing. We're currently migrating content into the tool so that it can be used. I think that's a good question. It is made in a way so you can have multiple assessments of the same product. So if there was someone that only wanted their own assessments, by all means, they can go through and reassess and create assessments. We would probably rather not have 10 or 15 for a specific eResource. We've also left space within the reports to leave comments. So if people want to discuss the results of a report or have comments, they can do that as well.
Claire Leverett asks, what happens when a resource doesn't meet all the accessibility requirements? Are you not allowed to license it? Are there any recourse?
So we have a few options if this is the case, and we're also still working through the impact that the assessments will have. It doesn't mean that we're not able to license it. In terms of our legislative requirements, we are obligated to provide access to these resources upon request. So what that means is we would have to figure out a way, either a workaround, different strategies depending on that eResources or what is not accessible in it, either the navigation or the content itself, to be able to help mitigate the impact of that on our users or patrons. So there are different strategies. One is to kind of provide a context where we can still support people who want to use that e-resource, even if it doesn't meet all of the accessibility requirements. I think if it was a very serious fail, we would look at maybe canceling that subscription. But first, we would try to follow up with the database vendor to see if there was any possibilities of improvements, especially since we can, with these assessments, very strategically pinpoint the issues that are being had and what constitutes a fail from our perspective. So we do have some options.
Andrea Miller-Nesbitt asks, have you published about this anywhere, or where can we read more or get updates on the project?
So we have written about this in a few, I believe specifically Ontario resources, and we can share some links to a few articles we've written. We have a project site as well, and I can share that link in the chat if I can track it down. And either way, we can share it with Jill to pass along to the group later.
Will do. And Adina Mulliken also asks, how did you develop the questions in the template?
So that was a pretty long process. We tried to be as thorough as possible looking at the different kind of assessments that existed or the checklist criteria that we had access to. So we looked at standards like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, Section 508, Amendment to the Rehabilitation Act, also barrier-free walkthrough, Tatamir accessibility checklists, the ASCLA, Association for Specialized and Cooperative Library Agencies. They had a Think Before You Buy guide, and also the Matterhorn Protocol. So those were all of the kind of standards that we used and reviewed. And what we did from there to develop the questions was very strategically going through that list and seeing, first of all, what was relevant to an e-resource or a database. That was kind of the first tool. And then further from there, just making sure that the criteria that were applicable could be tested in a really reliable, valid way. So that's kind of how, so we wanted to make sure that the questions incorporated all of the tools and support that you would need to think through to be able to answer them, if that makes sense.
Amy Dreyer, I was curious about the questions as well. Have you run them by an accessibility consulting firm? I'm not sure all elements on the page need to be keyboard accessible, only interactive elements, for instance. So have you run them by an accessibility consulting firm or experts in the industry?
We didn't use a third-party consulting firm, but we did do our testing with our student advisory group. So we did pull members of the college community, particularly those with disabilities and who use adaptive technologies. So that was kind of our way to also try to find the most relevant issues that we needed to address. So that's kind of one way that we were thinking it through.
And I had a question along those lines. So as you're developing those questions and tests, it sounds like it was more geared towards the user's experience in terms of the tests that you did. But if, say, you had a vendor that passed, you know, all accessible fully through, would that actually pass through any regulations that it was brought up against in some cases? So there's definitely the A, user experience, but there's also the B, the I guess the legal aspect of the regulation. So I'm just wondering, I guess it goes along the lines of that. If something has, passed the test in the template, what does that mean from a, regulation or legal standpoint?
So that's a great question. It does give us, so there's kind of two answers. So let me start with one, is that the legislation that we're working under is very broad. So it says that your e-resources have to be accessible and that you must provide accessible content upon request. So if something is not accessible, we, the library, have to find a way to make it accessible. So that's actually true for our print resources as well. We have to have a mechanism in place that allows that transition from inaccessible to accessible to happen. But beyond that, they don't tell us how. So this is one way to ensure that we're at least knowledgeable about what the issues are, and then from there develop ways to ensure the accessibility going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. We have another question from Sean Brennan. Can you give more detail about the embedded usage tips for user support on Open University UK? I'm not sure what I'm looking for on their website.
That's a great question, and I really love showing people this particular resource. So I'm going to throw the link in. Oh.
I think I just did that, Corinne.
Okay, you did. Great. So what you'll find if you click there is that, so for any database, for Academic Search Premier, for example, it has instructions for keyboard users recommending how they can refine their searches using the search options, i.e. not the clickable refined search that many people use on that left-hand side. So they kind of offer the quickest method of access and then provide supporting information about how to do that. So if you click on that link and you just scroll down to the accessibility tips, the database accessibility tips, you'll see each of the databases listed. And then there's kind of a black button that says databases accessibility tips. So depending on what the resource is, it has different things. So for example, the full text is not accessible to screen reader users as it is an image file. So it does point out different accessibility issues, and in some cases it offers tips on how to use it or what to do for further support. I love what they've done, so I'm happy that you have questions about it, because I want to make sure to give them all the props they deserve.
That's nice. Another question here. Have you considered whether chat reference, especially 24/7, would help with meeting legal requirements when navigation interfaces are not accessible? I'm thinking of chat reference staff by librarians or someone with expertise navigating with screen readers, etc. I'm not necessarily advocating the solution, just wondering what you think or whether it has come up.
That's a great question as well. And I think part of the process of LEAP in terms of getting our college staff familiar with what the issues are will help them in their other roles as well. So I think that how this translates to an interaction on the reference desk or an interaction via reference chat, for example, is kind of exactly what we're working towards as a more distant goal, but reachable. But this is kind of the first step. And again, making sure that people are aware of the issues, because if you're asking someone on chat, for example, they're not experiencing the same barriers that our users might be using a screen reader, for example. So making sure that people become aware of what that might look like and what barriers might be encountered, we're hoping can really strengthen the knowledge base and advocacy piece for our staff in the various departments that they work.
Okay, not seeing any other questions come through. Does anybody else have any other questions for Corinne and Siobán? Well, I thought that was a great presentation, so thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you so much for having us.
And anyone is welcome to follow up with us over email. There were a few questions of things that we said we could follow up on, so absolutely feel free to get in touch.
And it's through your project management site that we get to see updates or how it's developing and how other institutions are utilizing it in your sort of progress. Is that where that information would be?
Yes, do
right.
you have the link handy?
Okay.
Yep, I'm just putting it in now.
All right.
There's a bit of information here, but we are going to keep it up to date.
We also have a, oh yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. And obviously we're all on the discussion list. So if questions, after today, obviously you can shoot them in there as well. I know Corinne and Siobán are on there as well, so they can answer questions that might come up. So thank you for that. I did want to take a little bit of time here at the end of our meeting just to reach out to the group. Both Meredith and Meredith's coming in June, July timeframe as the convener, but we wanted to just get an understanding if this group is meeting your needs. I think the discussion list is great because there's a lot of, back and forth questions and answers going back. So I see a lot of value there. We just want to make sure that the group overall is meeting your needs. If these virtual meetings are working, we usually have one in the midwinter timeframe and one also at the end of the year, whether it was in person or virtual. Are the types of presentations that you like to have, or are there particular types of presentations you might like to see? If anybody has any feedback, you can feel free to unmute and tell us directly. Welcome to have an open conversation. You can also type it in the chat if you want. But we're just trying to get a gauge if the group is meeting your needs, if there's more things that we can do for you, or if it's just perfect the way it is, maybe a couple presentations a year just to show sort of some of these types of exciting projects that are going on that you might not be aware of. I'll throw it out to the group. Anyone else who's on? Any other suggestions? I know it's been brought up before. There's a lot of different groups that focus on accessibility. Here and there it's been mentioned, to merge them. Is that a desire of the team to, instead of having multiple places that you have to engage with questions around accessibility in institutions, that you'd prefer to merge them? Again, just trying to get a feel for what people are interested in looking at. I know there has been questions about vendors, and I think some of those came up in this presentation as well. Once you know that it's accessible, how do you approach the vendors? It looks like this is on the strategy plan for this team in LEAP as to how to then go, talk to vendors. If you have a group of libraries who are finding issue with particular database, can you use that, forum or allegiance of a group to go to vendors, with these types of suggestions or understanding about, what any deficiencies are. Again, anything? Go ahead, Adina.
Hi.
Hi.
So, well, I found this talk really helpful to know about what the LEAP group is doing. So thank you for organizing this, and also thank you to Meredith for volunteering to be the next convener. I was curious whether there might be a meeting at ALA annual in person, and I guess maybe part of that question is whether Meredith happens to be going, or if anybody else who is involved is going and interested to meet in person at annual. I'm not sure myself if I'm going to be able to go to annual, but I would volunteer to help if I do end up going.
So we didn't get a room directly to go to ALA annual in June. Sort of the official room request at this point. It was back in December actually, and missed the deadline. But it's also that question about who's going to be there available. We could very well set up something more informal, for the group to get together. It doesn't have to necessarily be that kind of an established meeting. But if the group, I could also ask, I know we're past the deadline, but if there's any capacity, if we can get in there. If not, we might be able to meet informally. We might be able to set up a type of even a group lunch to have discussion, just to bring people together around the same topic.
Yeah, if I was volunteering to help, I guess I forgot, Jill. I guess you'll still be the convener at annual. So I guess I should have asked if you're going more than if Meredith is going. If I was volunteering to help, I guess I would know closer to June whether or not I'm able to go. So if I was doing that, I guess a more informal thing might be something I could help with better, since you have to plan so far ahead for the official meeting rooms.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's kind of where I was sitting. If the group wanted to have an in-person meeting, I would be happy to go down there and facilitate that. And Meredith was also, leaning towards going in person as well, just to attend the conference. So I was going to leave it to the group and team. If that's something they would want, I would go down there in that capacity for the most part.
We're talking about annual in Chicago, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So if there was interest in that by the group, and I can throw the question out too on the list serve. We had thrown a survey out there a while ago, but we didn't get responses really. But I know people are quite busy, so I'm happy to do that also just through email. If there's, just to ask a question, if there's sufficient interest in people meeting up at that time, then we can coordinate something like that. And if there's, again, like feedback as to what you might like to see us doing more of, or is it meeting your needs, as is. I just want to, that was really what I wanted to do, is touch base. It's good to meet in person too, like you said, just to have those discussions and experiences as, everybody's sort of going through the same challenges. So, and I know the Big Ten Alliance is also addressing some of the accessibility challenges in that way as well. And I know they usually do meet and discuss that pretty thoroughly as well. But
well, I'll just say thank you, Jill, and I'll let other people talk here.
No, that's great. I'm not seeing too much else in the chat, so I'm not sure if anybody has anything to share. So if nobody does, we can convene early, if unless there's anything else anybody would like to talk about. That's the only thing I really wanted to get, is to make sure we were meeting your needs as a group. So it sounds like everybody's happy. I haven't heard anything. Well, that's great. If you're getting what you need out of the discussion group and maybe these couple of meetings, if you hear of any of exciting projects like LEAP, in passing in your travels, please bring it up to myself and Meredith. So, maybe we can see what we'd like to plan for June. We'll have a virtual meeting either way, but we might also see if we can organize a meeting, in ALA, if that makes sense. But please let us know, if there's any particular areas of interest that you'd like to, bubble up and share with the group. I think that would be great. So with that, if nobody else has any comments, I will thank again Corinne and Siobán for presenting to us today. It's an exciting project, and I'm sure a lot of us are going to be following it and may follow up with some questions directly with you guys. And thank you for your time and afternoon.
Thanks so much for having us.
Bye all. And that recording will be available, like I said, we'll send it out on the distribution list. I was diligently taking notes, but there's definitely a lot I'm sure that I missed. So so you should be seeing that in the distribution list within the next few days.